I think it's a wonderful idea that there is people that are interested in the local history. I think it's wonderful because it's just something that we have to cling to. There isn't too much in this plastic day world that, right now that needs preserving, I don't think. It's just too scientific altogether. But there's those things that were there from then showed that the people, how they had to exist, literally exist. They had to be artisans in their own way. They had to learn to cope with the country, cope with the environment and the climate and everything, and live, literally hew their way into the country. And they loved it, and they wouldn't trade it for anything because there was a lot of them. I know my mother and father were born right here, they died here, and they wouldn't have it any other way. And the rest of the people are the same way. It's just home, I guess, to a lot of people. And it's the scenery, it's just the overall district that you just seem to have a feeling that it's home and you can relate to it, and it's just there, that's all. The timbering brought the people in here, it's kept them here, and once you got a farm and a family, you put your roots down and you cling to those roots. The world was small in those days.
I don't think that anything that has to do with the early settlement of this country should be lost because of the fact that people here, whatever they accomplished, put out such a tremendous effort. All around this country, you see what they tried to do. Foundations of old log cabins, some fairly large buildings, abandoned mine shafts, stumps 4 feet across where the lumber companies worked. It's perhaps not what would be actually put in a history book, which needs a lot of statistics, but the human interest part of the country should be saved.
My name is Jean Pettifer Brown. My maiden name was Pettifer. I was born 57 years ago, last March, on this property in the farmhouse. And it is it's near 41 Highway. It's approximately halfway between Pembroke and Belleville, and to pinpoint it. And the community, my people were of pioneer stock, and my grandfather cleared this farm and built the house that's here.
Well, I am Nadine Brumell. I am 68. I live in Cloyne. At least I have lived in Cloyne for the past 8 years. I was born in what is now a ghost town called Bessemer, south of Bancroft, where my father was interested in mining iron a generation too soon. I have lived in a number of places, Sarnia, London. I lived in Toronto for 30 years. I have lived in Ottawa as a child. And when I decided where I was going to stay permanently, I couldn't think of any area I would rather be than right here. So I've been here for the past 8 years.
I was born here about approximately 57 years ago in the middle of a March blizzard, so I've been told, and my father had to go to Denby to get the doctor by horse and cutter. This farm is approximately in the Denby district, and I grew up here and I've loved it. We had a wonderful time. I helped to put the stones on the fences, and I've helped to build some of the log fences and things around here. And I helped to bring in the hay, and I helped to bring in the grain, and we used to have corn. I grow a lot of corn, and we had corn husking bees in the barn here, and people used to come from miles around, and we'd have a hoedown afterwards, and everybody would bring cake and stuff, and we'd have a wonderful time. My people were of Scotch descent. My father was English and Irish. My mother was Scotch, and they came in with the timber crews in the early days. Grandfather was a young man when he first came here, and he went back to Carleton Place and got his bride and brought her up here, and the family was all born around in this district. My mother helped to build the house right near here on this property by drawing the timbers out of the swamp.
Right here we're about 45 miles straight north of Napanee. To the southeast, Kingston is about 75 miles away. To the southwest, Belleville is roughly the same distance. We're in the area of the Precambrian rocks of the Grenville province of the Canadian Shield. The first people who were really interested in this area were the lumbermen. There are some records of square timber being taken out somewhat southwest of here as early as 1840. The larger lumber companies, who took their logs out to the sawmills, came a bit later than this. The Gilmore Company was one of the big ones. The Gillies came in from the Ottawa Valley. And later on, Peter McLaren and the Caldwells from Perth were interested in lumbering in this area and had camps over several counties. The Rathbons from Deseronto were here as well. And they kept on lumbering until it began to peter out in the 1880s. They drove on the Scutamata to Stokoe Lake, the Moira River, and Belleville. They drove on the Mazenau and down the Mississippi watershed out to Carleton Place and the Ottawa. North of here, of course, they drove the Madawaska. But the Mississippi and the Scutamata were the two main rivers for the logging drives out of here.
In the 1850s, and it was just complete wilderness. There wasn't anything but logging camps a lot of the time, and tiny settlements gathered around those logging camps. That's all Denby was at one time, was just a tiny settlement around a logging depot. Cloyne was a logging depot. And there was various depots all the way up and down the valley. And the men would come in in the logging crews. They'd see a piece of good land, what they considered good land. And if they didn't marry a local girl from the families that lived in around the camps, they would go and back home and pick up a girl that they had had their eye on before they left home and bring her up as a bride and settle here. And then some of them were too poor to get out again. But they kept on, and their families, and oftentimes if a woman lost her husband in a logging drive or logging accident, she married a widower that had lost his wife in childbirth or something, or some of the fevers they went through. And the families would be intermarried. There's a tremendous amount of that here through this district, because they were so far from the doctor. There was an awful lot of early deaths in those days. And you just made do, because up here, if you didn't have a husband to provide for you, you were just up against it, that was all. And so you had to accept the next one that come along.
Well, as lumbering was petering out, mining began to come on, but the country was being well settled before the timber began to run out. We had settlers coming in here in the 1850s. They came in at first to work in the logging camps, and some of them took up land. They came on foot, and they came with wagons. Some of them had horses, but oxen were used a great deal because they were heavy enough to drag things through the mud. Then in 1857 or thereabouts, the old Addington Road was started, the Colonist Road. It was finished in a few years. And this opened up land all along the route of the road, as far as the bridge across the Madawaska, which was in from the present village of Slate Falls. The old maps show so many old farms or lots taken up that are now abandoned. In some cases there are traces of old log buildings, but for the most part they're gone. And the Addington Road itself was a road by courtesy only. In the spring breakup, it was full of mud holes, and it was very rocky in spots because while dynamite had been known for a long, long time, they didn't always have it available, so they quite often used black powder, or sometimes they'd build a fire and heat up a tremendous rock and then throw cold water on it if it was just a little piece, and it would scale off for them. So it wasn't too many years, actually, before a lot of the people who had hoped to farm discovered there wasn't too much topsoil around here. The rock is very close to the surface. There was a little farming where the glacial soils had been deposited, like the sand flats east of Northbrook, where the soil is fairly deep, up around Denby, and even through here in river valleys and old river benches and so on. They found places to grow things, and were able to get a certain amount of cash by selling some of their produce to the lumber companies. And also they worked in the lumber camps and were able to make a little bit of money. But that meant quite often that a man would be away all winter and have to leave his wife to live in whatever facilities were available while he perhaps was working as far west as Gilmore. So it was a very hard life, very free for those who liked freedom on those terms, I suppose. Difficult, and really no place to earn any money unless it was in the lumber camps. Very tall, big trees, pines for the most part, were what the lumbering companies were after, the white pines. And they cut them all. In fact, there were copies of orders to some of their foremen around saying, don't leave a pine stop standing between here and here. They left the slash on the ground. Of course, it regularly burned and the topsoil blew off. I would think it was a very rugged area to pioneer. People didn't really have the resources. These were people who either came from the old country or were third generation of families who had moved into from along the river, from New York State and Pennsylvania and so on, along the St. Lawrence and the Bay of Quinte. And by the time their grandchildren were around, there wasn't any land. So some of them came back this way and took up land. Some of them were warned that it wasn't good farming land, and at least a couple of people, a man named Russell with the federal government, or the Upper Canada at that time, shortly before Confederation, and Allen Gilmore of the Gilmore Lumber Company, both warned against trying to farm this area.
Well, you got up early in the morning, you had your breakfast, before breakfast you went out and milked. Then you come in and had your porridge, and or brose, whichever you happen to have. Mother was a great hand for brose. It was a very indigestible dish made up of rye flour, browned and then cooked with hot water. But we liked it. They're healthy young animals, I guess. And then you went to school. And you walked a mile down to the local school. And at one time, the school down there was made up mainly of Pettifers. There was quite a crew of us. But you walked down to a mile to school. And then when you come home, there was chores to do, cows to get. And the cattle coming in at the back here put me in mind of my brothers and myself too, oftentimes, having to go and get the cows from the back fields and bring them in. And then you did your homework by candlelight, or lamplight with us, it was. We had kerosene lamps, and went to bed at a very early hour because you had to get up unless you wanted to go and play a little bit, you know. And but the life was very rugged because you had to really work here to make a living, and you had to put up with a lot of privations. You didn't have indoor plumbing. You didn't have. You had to grow a lot of your own produce, and you had to be very self-sufficient. And you raised your own wool, and or if you didn't happen to have sheep, you got some someplace, and that was a chore in the evening for the girls to card the wool into bats, and so my mother could make comforters and bed covering. She didn't have a spinning wheel, but I guess she could. Some of the women around the district had their own spinning wheels, and they spun their own wool. Mother always knit all our stockings. She helped with the milking. She had a big garden, and she did the washing by hand, and all the ironing, the mending, and the cooking. She baked her own bread. She'd set it set it, as they called it, at night, and the next day she'd bake loaves and loaves and loaves of bread because, as I said before, there was a big crew of us. And that was pretty much the same way all the women had to do that. You had to get your own living. You literally, it didn't come in cans. I didn't know what canned stuff was like, except what she put up as preserves. I didn't know oranges came at Christmas, and soda biscuits were something that you had only when you were sick. And the doctor was, as I said, about 8 miles away, and you didn't get too much care. It was mostly home remedies. And you went on picnics. You went berry picking. It wasn't anything for my mother to have, say, 100 quarts of wild strawberries done up in the summertime. And we kids picked them and brought them home by the pailful. And raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, climbed hills, climbed those mountains over there and picked blueberries. And we all enjoyed it. We loved it.
Much later, after the gold discovery at El Dorado, north of Madoc, there was a gold rush into that area, and the miners began to spread out. Nothing was discovered in here, however, until, 20 years after El Dorado. Then the Geological Survey began to send geologists in, and gold was picked up in roughly over 40 miles between Marmor and South Sherbrooke Township to the east of us, in small amounts. And some of the surface samples they found had a lot of free gold, and there was a terrific amount of excitement. In fact, I think the Belden Atlas, if I remember correctly, of 1871, speaking of El Dorado, said that This was going to be a tremendous new mining country, gold mining country, and that Belleville was the Golden Gate. That's almost a quotation. So there were a lot of disappointed people over a period of time. Well, the shaft behind me is the old ore chimney. It was supposed to be a gold mine. I understand that there's a quartz vein about a foot wide that carried usable gold values, but not enough tonnage. 1 foot vein won't take a mining company very far when they're looking for a few millions returns on their investment. But it was staked by a Mohawk prospector in the area, Johnny Bay, in about 1903, I think. And he sold out his interest to some people named Fletcher. And I believe the Fletchers came from somewhere near Hamilton, over in the peninsula anyway. They were interested in several mines around here, and they did the original financing on the ore chimney. At one time, they would have perhaps between 20 and 30 men working here. They tried to use local people as much as possible. But it turned out that they weren't producing enough gold to be bothered. But because of the geology here, which looks as if something ought to be in this valley, different people have tried. When the original ore chimney closed around 1910 or thereabouts, it was left for a while. It was opened again in the teens and the 20s and the middle 30s, when the people at that time promoting it built a powerhouse over on the Scutamata to bring power into the mine. And the foundations of their old powerhouses are still there on the river. But even so, they went down 700 feet, and they got these interesting values on this narrow vein, but they still couldn't make it pay, so they closed down again. They probably weren't the last. People are always running in and out of here hoping something will happen.
They talked about the good old days. They are very good in a lot of ways because people had a community spirit, I think, more so than they have today, because you had to depend on your other people. You had to depend on the people that were around. That you couldn't really be self-sufficient or leave your neighbors out of anything. You had to join them in work and in play and in community spirit. Things are more comfortable today, but there was more of an enjoyment of life, a slowness that isn't missing now. Each generation seems to have be speeded up that much more. And as you get older, you wonder if we're not going too fast. And you wonder when the brakes should be put on. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is trying to put a few brakes on and try to bring back those old days, if we ever can.
This is Lake Mazenah, and all around me is Bon Echo Provincial Park. Across the water is the great cliff, which is called Bon Echo Rock. This area was given to the province in the neighborhood of 12 years ago, perhaps a little bit more, by Merrill Dennison, who was a well-known Canadian historian. A great many of the Canadian artists, painters of the teens and 20s came here, some of them for a holiday, and many purposely to paint the rock and some of the beauties of the surrounding area. A.Y. Jackson was one of the ones best known for his visits here. Varley was here. I believe Harris, and probably Arthur Lismer of the School of Seven, although I am not too sure about Lismer. But it was a gathering place for people who painted and wrote and came simply to enjoy the spectacular scenery of the area.
I think the rural life has advantages over the city life because why is it there's so many city people coming back here and they drive miles and they work all week and then drive miles to get back in the rural district, and just as soon as they get their pension plan through, they make it back in here into the rural life, and it's rapidly becoming almost urban as it is. I don't think they could put up with quite the privations that my father and father put up with. I don't think they'd care to go by horse and cutter or horse and buggy to the nearest store for their what they'd absolutely have to have once a week, or even lay in a supply like my father had to do him a year. When he went away it was a yearly trip, or even a twice yearly maybe sometimes, to say Renfrew or Napanee or Tweed, and you laid in 100 pounds of things, sugar and flour and all that kind of stuff. You had to get that stuff. They wouldn't want to do that now.
Well, they had a tremendous amount of courage to tackle it at all, for one thing, and a great deal of physical strength, because the ones who didn't just couldn't get along. They had to get out and swing a broad axe, and the crude tools they had to use. They, for the most part, in the early days at least, used oxen or carried pack sacks on their shoulders. I have been told that some people actually carried in sacks of grain from the mills, you know, from Flinton and even from out around Napanee. They didn't think anything of walking 30 or 40 miles. I would say courage was outstanding, and a kind of a grim determination, because they had to make a home. I suppose the majority of them had nowhere else to go, and they grew to like the country. The younger people in this area, on the whole, are not being told. Stories are not being passed on. So that right now we have here the last generation of people who will remember anything about the early history of this area, and that will be only hearsay. There are still men living who worked in the old mines, but nobody who belongs to the original settlement group. There would be grandchildren here. So it's a case of now or never. It's going to be gone.
The younger people have, I don't think they're worse off in one way, because they have a different set of values, a different environment. The world is smaller to them. They can go and see so many different things that we couldn't see. But I have a feeling that most of them are rootless. They haven't got what we call the old roots in the soil and the home and the homesteads and the land that we all love, that's all. It's a place for them to come and roar around for a little while, and away they go again. And to go someplace else to see something else. They're forever searching for something else over the next